Good morning and welcome to Newsmakers. Jokes abound about the differences between the east side and the west side, which are divided in local lore by a sauerkraut curtain. There's a touch of truth under all those jokes. The east side of the county is heavily developed with industry, office parks, and dozens of incorporated towns and cities. The west side, especially beyond I-275, is relatively sparsely settled, has few major businesses, and only a few water and sewer lines. What can western Hamilton County become when it grows up? That's the issue that Hamilton County planners, local elected officials, and its citizens will be discussing in two public meetings this week aimed at developing a collaborative plan. A few days ago, I sat down to discuss the options with three of the key people involved in the planning process. Caroline Andrews is the Planning Services Administrator for the Hamilton County Regional Planning Commission. We discussed the options that have been defined thus far. Caroline, thanks for being here with us this morning. Western Hamilton County, when you think about that, what are its assets? What are the qualities out there that maybe people don't fully recognize?
Well, it's a real diverse area. It's actually about 40% of the land area of the county, but only a very small portion of the population actually lives there. It's characterized by a lot of steep slopes. It has a lot of floodplain. It's very rural.
And are those the reasons why it hasn't been developed as much as the eastern portions, because of that geography?
The geography has been a big contributor. Also, just the fact of the geography is limiting with water and sewer going into the area. So most of the area, especially west of the Great Miami River, is unsewered. One of the things that you've been working on is developing different scenarios for the way that western Hamilton County can develop. Very briefly, let's take a look at some of those scenarios. Scenario number one, how would you describe that? What are its principal characteristics? That scenario really seeks to preserve some of the rural character of the west side. It also preserves some of the farmland. It's basically a low growth option.
People ultimately opt for scenario one. How is that different than scenario four, which is, if I understand it correctly, is sort of to do nothing particular, just to sort of let natural patterns continue?
In order to achieve the first scenario, you'd really need to have some policies in place that we don't have now. The trend would allow development to occur on hillsides, but we would have to have some policies in place that would limit hillside development. You'd also have to have some policies in place to probably increase, take more zoning control.
Scenario number two.
Scenario two attempts to combat the effects of sprawl. Rather than letting growth just occur happenstance, it really tries to keep new growth related to where there's existing growth. And it tries to follow sewer shed areas so that it's a more compact development. We now just allow growth to occur according to market forces. So this tries to do something outside of the market force.
Seems to me, in looking at scenario number three, that's the most elaborate, complex, and maybe has the biggest impact on western Hamilton County. How would you describe that?
I'll start with one word, and that's bridge, because that's really a key component of scenario number three. With scenario three, we're looking at a bridge across the Ohio River that will link the west side to the airport, to northern Kentucky, where, as you know, there are an awful lot of jobs, and it also allows people from there to come into western Hamilton County for jobs. A unique feature about number three is that we have an area that we're calling a sort of a job growth and high density employment growth area right around the 275 and 74 interchange areas. And that would really be a magnet for growth.
In addition to professional planners, the process involves representatives from various western Hamilton County communities. To discuss the implications of these four scenarios, I also sat down with Bill Seitz, a trustee from Green Township, and Larry Kinnett, a trustee from Harrison Township. Bill, there's a lot of different perspectives on these plans, a lot of different plans out there. From Green Township's perspective, how do you see these different plans? Do you have something that you think is particularly important to Green Township?
We are committed to growth. And the two things that I like best about the plans are, number one, a proposal to bring sewer and water to the entirety of western Hamilton County. It's shocking to me that as we enter the 21st century, we have such a large area without sewer or water. And number two, we definitely and desperately need access to northern Kentucky, which is where the big job growth is going to be over the next 20 years, in order to give our current residents and our future residents access to a good job market.
Does that mean that, I know going in, there's still a lot to be studied about all this, but from Green Township's perspective, something that favors scenario 3?
I think probably we would be looking at a cross between scenario 2 and 3. We like the controlled growth aspects of scenario 2, but we think in the long run, for the good of Hamilton County and western Hamilton County, we need to develop a job base in western Hamilton County and tap into the one that's emerging in northern Kentucky. We've grown and prospered because historically we were close to the Mill Creek Valley and downtown, both of which areas are in decline. So we need to tap into a good job market.
Well, Larry, you are on the western side of the Great Miami River and may have a different perspective. There may be a little bit different dynamic than on the Green Township side. How do you look at these different options, and what are the concerns of people in your area?
Well, I think that's true. We do have a little different perspective. I think in Harrison Township, the residents would like to preserve the rural or country estate type character that we have in our community. However, we do recognize the need for some commercial, light industrial type developments to enhance our tax base. These type of services produce more revenue and require less public expenditures. We don't have that now, or don't have much of it, and we think the sewer and water, once it comes into the area, will provide us as necessary tools so that we can look into that and hopefully attract some people.
My understanding would be that if that bridge is built, scenario number 3, the most dramatic of the 3 proposals, if that bridge is built, that would have a lot of impact just on traffic, especially down in your area, because it would track up 128. Is that correct?
The bridge is identified in scenario number 3. I think there's some people on the steering committee that support the bridge as a possibility in a different scenario. So I wouldn't want to limit the bridge just to scenario 3. I do think that that is important as far as a traffic problem. I personally feel that one of the things I would like to see this whole thing accomplish is that the necessary road improvements would be identified and would take place either proceeding or in the early stages of the development, rather than waiting till it is a congestion problem and try to do the construction then after the congestion is already on the roadways, which even multiply the problem.
I think our model is sort of Anderson Township. And when you talk about congestion, they have the bridge, the 275 bridge. That made Anderson Township. And it's not an unduly congested place. It's a great place with high-end residential, good shopping opportunities, and some degree of commercial tax base. So I would invite those people who are knee-jerk opposed to any kind of development to take a ride out there and ride through some of the roads, and they'll see that it's a beautiful community. And we can be like that too.
Bill, there's going to be these meetings next week or this week for people to come in, look at these issues, have some input. Who ultimately, or how ultimately, are decisions going to be made about what does happen?
We're going to take all the public input that they care to offer, and then the steering committee of the plan will work with the consultants and try to refine and tweak the various scenarios to be the one that best represents what both the elected officials and the public have to say about this. So it will be an ongoing process, and then ultimately, of course, each political subdivision has a great deal of say over what happens within its respective territory.
There's a lot of different entities here. There's a number of different townships, there's a number of different cities, but not as many on the east as on the east side. That's a different character on the west side. So a lot of different political entities. Are the right political entities in place to carry out whatever vision is developed here? the counties and the townships, are they capable of implementing this sort of plan?
Obviously, a bridge scenario would involve the need for federal money to help build that bridge, but we work very closely with the county engineer and our county commissioners. They're the ones that are going to have a great deal to say over prioritizing water and sewer. I think the good news is that the townships and small cities that are part of our planning group get along well, for the most part, with one another and are able to relate to one another. We share a common heritage, we share a common work ethic, and I think there is a greater opportunity for cooperation amongst our group than there would be amongst a larger group. The city of Cincinnati, for example, is not part of our group. The city of Cincinnati, in fact, wanted to do its own study because Mayor Qualls was afraid that our plans would interfere with the city's plans, meaning that our gain would be her loss. We did not invite the city of Cincinnati to be part of this process because we knew that their goals were intrinsically opposed to our goals.
Mayor Qualls is a person who holds out regionalism all the time, but I think we all speak about regionalism as cooperation and whatever. Right. Could there be a chance to be a little bit more regional here?
Sure. If the city would like to turn the Cincinnati Water Works and the Metropolitan Sewer District over to a regional agency for the benefit of everyone, that would be a real strong step. But I've never heard Mayor Qualls discuss regionalism in any context other than people outside the city paying for improvements inside the city.
If Western Hamilton County is developed so that the facilities, the sewer, the water, the capabilities, the infrastructure is there, does this hold out the hope that, for example, Hamilton County will then have a better ability to attract new business as opposed to Butler, Warren, or Northern Kentucky? Is that one of the things that will come out of this?
I would hope so. I would hope that would enhance Hamilton County's as a drawing card for industry, commercial business in the area. We need something to compete right now with our neighboring counties because we're not doing a real good job of that.
I call it the last great frontier, and it's really an imperative for Hamilton County that we properly plan this growth that's going to occur in Western Hamilton County. That's a real important point. The trend line, without any planning, shows for a lot of change in Western Hamilton County. We're trying to be ahead of the curve and plan for how best to maximize that change to our collective financial benefit. Not personal financial benefit, but I mean as a community in economic development terms. And so it is the last great frontier. There isn't any developable land left in eastern Hamilton County or central Hamilton County. They're talking about brownfields redevelopment. We're talking about land that is, in essence, virgin that can be developed properly.
If you would like to find out about the details of the proposals for the collaborative plan for Western Hamilton County, there will be 2 public meetings this week. On Wednesday night, August the 19th, at the Green Township Administration Building, and on Thursday night, August the 20th, at the Whitewater Township Senior Center on Dry Fork Road. Both meetings will start at 7 o'clock. Stay tuned. Coming up next is a fascinating look at what Cincinnati might have become and what we can learn from that. Welcome back. In graduate school, I remember reading a book about counterfactual hypotheses. If some one thing had been different in the past, how would history have been altered? In a sense, that's the basis for an intriguing exhibit entitled Unbuilt Cincinnati at the Contemporary Arts Center. Add to the exhibit the vision and opinions of its organizer, architect David Scheer, and you have something that not only teases the imagination, but challenges us to think harder about the structures we are about to build downtown, including on the riverfront.
The greatest goal is to make people aware that when a building is proposed in a place like downtown Cincinnati, it represents the entire city. It's not just an individual choice being made by the developer or his architect, but that it really is a matter of public concern. And that over time, these individual decisions add up and they make the city that we all use and that represents all of us.
One whole gallery is devoted to the 1980s and 90s stumbling non-process to figure out what to do with what was then called Fountain Square West. The most daring proposal came from Helmut Jahn.
This particular design is very modernistic, very technical looking, makes a great celebration of its structure. And as I recall, when it was proposed, there were 2 schools of thought. One was that this was a wonderful thing that would lead Cincinnati into the future. The other one was that this was a horrible thing that would disgrace the city and pull down the level of architecture overall. I don't think it's appropriate for that site. It's considerably taller than Carew Tower, and not only does it not set back from the street as Carew Tower does, it actually protrudes further the higher it goes. And so I think it would have really kind of beetled over the square and really had an undesirable impact on the feeling of being in the square.
There was an alternative.
The Cohn-Pedersen-Fox proposal for Fountain Square West, which I think was an enormously sensitive piece of urban architecture because the building responds to the different scales of the city. The pedestrian scale, the sort of 10-story scale of commercial buildings of the end of the 19th century, the 20-story scale of commercial buildings of the middle part of this century, and finally the real tall scale of Carew Tower and some of the other skyscrapers around. And it does so in a fashion which is not backward-looking but forward-looking. The architectural vocabulary is of today, or of 1989 anyway, not retro, as people like to say now, and yet it still finds a place very comfortably in the present urban fabric.
The models and drawings in Unbuilt Cincinnati are the artifacts from a long-running conversation about what the center of the city should become.
The participants in the conversation, though, to me that's the question, really, who gets to talk? Certainly the developers get to talk. The city gets to talk, but sometimes chooses not to say much. I'm following your metaphor of the conversation. And to my way of thinking, in Cincinnati, the public doesn't get to say much at all. And I think that this is really a problem because, as I said before, these really are matters of public concern. And in order for the thing to be successful, it has to have a certain amount of public support and understanding. Otherwise, it's just something which is being sort of forced upon the city without the public's approval, or at least acceptance, and that, to my mind, is not democratic.
Perhaps the most intriguing element in the Fountain Square Gallery is an animated video produced just for the exhibit.
The video incorporates Fountain Square as it appeared in 1930, but also these two unbuilt skyscrapers. And so we combined Fountain Square as it used to be, but no longer is, with Fountain Square as it might have been, but never will be. So it's kind of two different kinds of fantasy about Fountain Square. I think the goal of the video was simply to get people imagining what is still possible. We're really only limited by our imagination. People talk about economics as though it were a constraint, but we found $500 million to build a football stadium. If we can do that, we could do any number of things.
The most distinctive feature of Fountain Square in the 1930s was the esplanade in the center of 5th Street.
I like it for the fact that it's a kind of unique urban space. You don't find long, skinny urban spaces like that as much as you do traditional squares. On the other hand, I imagine that the reason Fountain Square is reconfigured is because now it is a pedestrian place. So the present square is a better pedestrian place, the older square a more unique urban place.
The larger second gallery explores other unbuilt plans. So this is the model for
the Saarinen Church, Church of Christ, on 4th Street and Sycamore. This was proposed in 1948 and not built, as I understand, for financial reasons. The reason...
What were its good qualities?
Well, normally you would expect a major church to have a lot of public space around it. If you think of, for example, Covenant Church at the end of Garfield Place. In a dense area like 4th Street, that would seem to be inappropriate. And the Saarinens solved the problem by taking the kind of large space that you expect to have before you enter a major religious institution and putting it inside the building. I think this would have been a spectacular indoor space in a series of such spaces that Cincinnati already has, like the Carew Arcade.
What do you think of this sort of Italianate?
Last time I checked, Cincinnati is nowhere close to Italy. I don't really understand why this sort of thing belongs in Cincinnati. I understand why architects like it, but it smacks a little of Disneyland to me. That is to say, an artificial environment sort of grafted onto a place with no real connection to the place.
The exhibit also explores unbuilt proposal for what's on every Cincinnatian's mind these days, the riverfront. Before World War I, planners developed a proposal to put the city's rail yards in the bottoms, anchored by a Penn Station-style terminal at 3rd and Main.
I think if it had been built now, we'd be pretty unhappy, because it would make the redevelopment of the riverfront much more difficult than it already is, and it's already quite difficult. At the time, people were not interested in the riverfront as a recreational area. They thought it was an industrial area. There were tanneries and other industrial uses down there that were pretty noxious in terms of the smells that they emitted. So people were not looking to join downtown with the river. They were actually looking for a way of separating downtown from the river. I think to some degree this was also the mentality when the decision to build Fort Washington Way was made.
Does Unbuilt Cincinnati have anything to say about the proposals to use the riverfront for professional sports stadiums?
I think so. I think one of the things you can learn from looking at our exhibit is that each building that's built makes a little step towards a particular kind of future city. And a decision to build a stadium like the one that's going to be built for the Bengals sends a very particular message about the relationship between that facility and the city. That's a building which has a very active form and essentially demands a lot of open space around it in order for that form to be appreciated. It's not a building that makes worthwhile space around itself. That's a choice that was made. What it means is that the pattern that's being set for our riverfront right now is a bunch of objects set widely spaced from each other, where the objects become the focus and not the space in between. To me, that sends a message of symbols of enormous wealth and power, occupying public land while not creating kind of spaces that might actually serve a public purpose. Now, it's true that the Park Board and others are developing plans for a park that will occupy some of the area between the Bengal Stadium and the Red Stadium on the wedge. We will see how that goes. But in any event, it's still objects in a park at the best, rather than a new kind of urban composition that uses buildings and open space together.
There was an option proposed by Michael Graves in 1995.
So this takes an entirely different attitude towards the space around the stadiums. Whereas the present stadiums are essentially objects to be seen in isolation, these buildings are very conscious of their ability to make space in and around themselves. For example, this semicircular plaza that he was going to create with the entrance to the ball field on one side and the entrance to the Hall of Fame on the other, then opening you out to the riverfront.
It's interesting here, on this one, Michael Graves was putting these together, as you said, and creating spaces. UDA intentionally said they had to be pushed way apart.
Right. Because
Is that a basic mistake?
No, it's not a basic mistake. If UDA's intention had been followed through on, it would have been, I think, a very good thing. UDA's idea was to separate the stadium so that you had a big piece of city that would extend from the present downtown down to the riverfront. They needed a certain amount of it to attain a kind of critical urban mass. But that's not what's being done.
In recent years, Cincinnati has seemed peculiarly inept at making decisions about its future. Can any city make these type of decisions in a more orderly way?
They can, and they do. Other cities do. Portland, Oregon, Chattanooga, Tennessee come to mind as examples of cities that have very successfully planned and managed growth and redevelopment.
Finally this morning, I want to take a few minutes to call attention to a major genealogical convention that will be in town this week. Researching family history is the second most popular hobby in the United States. A few weeks ago, I talked with one of the organizers about the conference and his personal experience doing genealogy over the last 31 years.
When my first child was born, I got a little baby book, first tooth, first haircut, and had a little genealogy chart in there. And I began filling out the chart. I asked the parents what they might know about the family. I was surprised what they didn't know and called a few great aunts, cousins, cemeteries, funeral parlors, and I was amazed at the amount of information that was available in my family. Once you make that initial search, you need to go to the library, and in Cincinnati we're very lucky to have one of the largest genealogical and history departments in the United States. At the library, there will be information such as the census. Beginning in 1850, particularly, it will list everybody in the household. It'll tell their age, where they were born, what the occupation was.
The conference will be held at the Cincinnati Convention Center from Wednesday through Saturday and is open to everyone with all sorts of programs and offerings.
Any number of classes throughout the day where you can learn how to do your particular brand of genealogy, such as how to trace your Jewish ancestors or your African American ancestors, German, French, Swiss, how to do Pennsylvania research, so it's by locality and so forth. Almost all of the sessions list whether it's for a beginner, an intermediate, or an advanced person doing genealogy.
Thank you for making Newsmakers a part of your Sunday morning. Join us again next week. I will sit down with the new Cincinnati Public Schools Superintendent, Steve Adamowski.